In today's segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism, I'm excited to have Phil Borges, who is co-director of the documentary CRAZYWISE. CRAZYWISE was released in 2017. It follows the story of two people who were in mental crisis, how they ended up working through it. But part of the history of this is that Phil has been a photojournalist for years and was working with indigenous cultures, and recognized that a number of people in these indigenous cultures had experiences, had behaviors that in our Western culture would be called serious mental illness. And yet in those cultures, people were embraced or at least mentored, and there was value to such experiences. And that led him to question, what's the difference? Why is one culture, or not one, but one type of culture getting value from this, and why are so many people not helped within the more Western cultures? So Phil, I just wanted to give just a brief summary, and I know we'll talk more about it, but thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very good introduction. Thank you.
Wanted to keep it short. So, and I did send you some topics, and I know that we're not going to get to everything, but one of the things that, given that the documentary has been out for 6 years now, I do want to touch a little bit on the response. But before that, I'd like to get a little more information about the documentary itself. I know there's a number of interviews, a number of articles, so I don't want to, focus too much on that. But I'm curious about, how did this process go between when you started questioning and wondering, hey, what's going on here, and how you made the decision to make the film?
Well, it really started in 1994 when I had a chance to go and watch the Dalai Lama's oracle. I should explain, in the Tibetan tradition, the people who go into alternate states of consciousness, non-ordinary states, to either become a visionary or do healing, go by different names in different tribes I've found. With the Tibetans, they call these people Kutin. So I was invited to watch this 30-year-old monk, known as a Kutin, go into trance and I guess we would call it channel the disembodied spirit of the Nechung oracle. And that is the protector spirit of the Tibetan people. So it was very dramatic, very ceremonial. He went into trance, and then he fainted, and he had to be carried from the room. And there was part of me thinking that this could be a performance, just a elaborate. I didn't know what it was exactly, but anyway, after a couple of days, the person I was with, who invited me to go, it was a journalist for the London's Daily Telegraph doing a story on the Kutin. We were invited to go and interview him. And one of the questions that Mick asked the Kutin was, how did you get started in this? And he listed a set of symptoms, like he was having personality changes. He was going through what he called extreme mood changes, having nightmares, seeing things, and especially hearing voices. And he also talked about this energy, like a lightning bolt, he described it, that went up his spine, and it was very painful. And he thought he was dying. Well, those are a lot of the symptoms. I ended up, over my next 30 years of documenting tribal and indigenous cultures, mainly for human rights issues, and hearing that a similar story from their seers and healers, the people we call shaman. So as time went on, I just became more and more curious about it. And when I went into a tribe, one of the first things I would ask, who are your healers, or who are your visionaries? And if I could, I would interview them and ask them mainly that question: how did you get started in this? And the symptoms ranged very often. It was a feeling of just, they couldn't describe the feeling, but it was scary. And most of them thought they were dying.
Right.
They were having visions, they were hearing voices, they were having, some of them had what the Kutan talked about, that what we call a Kundalini feeling up the spine. But it was just interesting that not only were these symptoms similar, but how the tribe looked at it. It was looked at as sort of a special sensitivity that they had. And it was a sensitivity that they knew had to be mentored. And in other words, it was uncomfortable. The person going through it usually was very frightened about what was happening to them, but they were reassured that they had this special sensitivity, could be very valuable to the tribe if it was handled and they went through their initiation with a mentor.
Yeah.
I mean, usually they had a mentor, and usually it was an older shaman, and they would go through the mentoring process and then be accepted in the tribe as a gifted healer or seer.
Wow. You know, there's so many things just in that part that we could spend quite a bit of time on. Because I know as soon as you said the thing about the energy rising up the spine, I knew in other places they call that Kundalini, which is one type of these awakenings. You also mentioned non-ordinary or altered states of consciousness, which ties in with, you know, I know you know where the name belly flopping into mysticism comes from, the Joseph Campbell quote.
Right.
It says the psychotic person drowns in the same water that a mystic delights in. And just even, I didn't really think about it till this morning. I mean, I thought, gee, if people are drowning, you at least throw flotation devices out to them, you know, something that floats that they can hang on to. But what you just described with this mentorship is it really is kind of this elder, this person who understands, actually going out and kind of saving them in a sense, you know, helping them navigate that, whatever that is, that consciousness is what.
Yeah, somebody who's been through it,
Yeah.
usually.
Yeah.
Understands at that level, because it isn't something you can really describe, I found. It's ineffable.
And yet people try, which isn't a bad thing, but that adds to when you're in it and you try to describe it, there's so much force and energy that by itself turns people off or makes people afraid. But you feel this need to try and describe what's happening. And so, and that actually ties in with.
Well, you've been through this, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So when you tried to describe it, who did you first, can you remember who you tried to describe it to?
Well, so I was actually in Banff, Alberta on what was supposed to be a 4-day vacation. And at the lowest point, there was a ka-chink to my ego, and that happened the week before. And that just kind of released what was all this pent up grief, all this pent up trauma going back 10, 15 years. And that all unleashed. So there was a lot of energy. And so I actually, and I'm pretty sure I still have them somewhere, but this was in the day of calling cards. And so I have like a deck of just telephone calling cards of people I reached out to. You know, there was my parents. I of course had to, back up. I was supposed to fly home on a Sunday. The night before, I was actually afraid to get on a plane, convinced I'd be killed in a plane crash, which I knew was not normal. I was never afraid to fly before, but just as all these pieces came flying out, and I was sobbing next to the motel bed, just, what is this? I know there's a purpose for it. I understand all the toxicity that I'd been crutching, you know, so it was awakening. And at that point, while I was sobbing, I actually felt the souls of 2 friends of mine who had died. One died 11 years earlier at the age of 20 in a car accident, and the other died only 3.5 months earlier from complications of a weak heart and a weak heart valve. And so to feel that presence kind of out of the blue was just like, wow. You know, and you could talk about believing in miracles, but to feel that energy and recognize it, you know, I wasn't thinking of them first. I felt the energy first. And then it was like, wow, that's Nikos and Karen. And so I ended up staying up in Banff for an extra week, but there was definitely this fear that if I left Banff, which is, a small community, it's, 10, 15,000 or something, that if I tried to make it back to the States too soon, that I would be in a car accident or something would derail those plans. That it was like, hey, I'm safe here. I have enough money. I can stay up here long enough. So I ended up staying in Banff an extra 8-9 days.
So you were alone.
Yeah.
Except for these feelings of
Yeah.
entity.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And I got to a point. What's that?
Did you ever, can you remember when you first described it to somebody you knew or somebody?
It's hard because for me, it was about seeing the toxicity in my life. And so because I was living in Western Washington at the time, but my family and some of my close friends were in Montana, nobody knew all the pieces. And that's why how I've come to describe it is that if ever I was bipolar, which I've never agreed with that, I consider it a misdiagnosis. If ever I was bipolar, I had one foot out in Western Washington and one foot in Montana. And I was kind of leading a double life that way. So since then, I've been able to come up with any number of different descriptions. But at the time, you don't have that. And, and actually it was in the interview with Robert Whitaker that I remember at some point in that time that I said, there's a reason for this. I'm going through this to help give a voice to it. That type of thing. I got to figure out how to describe this. And I have one master's degree in statistics, which goes to the analytical side, but I also have a master's in German, which goes to how do you translate things? How do you use language? And I thought, how do you describe this? And the best I could come up with is that if you were to make a timeline, a timeline of history over the last 1,000 years and documented all the crap we've done to each other, the wars, genocide, abuse, the slavery, all of that. That's a lot of stuff. Now tip that on end, and that's the weight that was bearing down on me in Banff. That's pretty intense.
So it's almost as generational issues you were bearing.
Generational, cultural, absolutely, yeah. So it was because it expanded to more than just the systems I was crutching. So there's a part out of statistics that had to do with I'm going to get a little nerdy, but called abstract algebra. And for me, as I looked at the first system of abuse that I'd been crutching, toxicity, I was like,
you're using the word crutching,
codependent, enabling. I didn't walk away, that type of thing.
Okay.
But for me, it was like, where does that system end? This is a toxic system. Where does that system end? And at first you would say, oh, it's just the members of that group. But we all go out into our communities and we carry that behavior and how we look at things out into the rest. And so as you look at where is this closed system, you end up looking at everything. It goes to the quote that says, if you tug on one thread in the universe, it unravels everything. And it goes to that kind of, and I know you know this because some of it's in the documentary, but kind of that oneness, that overall collective, and that was part of my experience. And again, it wasn't till later, but it was like I could see all this energy and how it flowed and how it manifested, which is kind of cool, but it comes through a lot of force. And so that's why, I think there's a number of people who are trying to deal with that. And it goes to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey of going from you could say a known realm of consciousness into a non-ordinary realm of consciousness. But then the hero facing it, and one of the steps is to face death, right? And then you come back to this known realm of consciousness, but you have elixir and you have boon to share with society. And that brings us back to CRAZYWISE, is that in the indigenous cultures, they might not word it the way I just did, but they recognize, hey, there's something about this type of journey or this type of experience. And yeah, so thanks for asking me the questions, but I'm supposed to ask you. supposed to
Okay,
ask some
go ahead.
questions. We may have to schedule a second session.
Well, one of the things I heard a lot from people was when they tried to explain it, especially to the people that really had a lot invested in them, their parents, their lovers, their boss, their best friends. It scared their bosses or their friends or their parents. And that fear translated because they said I was in such a vulnerable place at the time. I was open to anything and to especially to feelings. And
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
those feelings came onto me, and that's what did a lot of the damage.
Yeah,
I mean,
you're absorbing their fears. Yeah. Yeah, I totally, I call it a blown open state of the nervous system that some call it an ego collapse, where the ego structure, if you think of it as like, I think it's Freud who said it's kind of the filter between the subconscious and the conscious. And so it's kind of a protective thing. Well, if that's not functioning and that collapses, all of that energy flows back and forth. And so, yes, when people are projecting, you know, and it is fearful. It's fearful for the person, and I can see where it'd be fearful for the people closest.
Yeah,
you know, but at the same time, when you project, you know, it's not even projecting that fear. It's that we emanate energy. And so I have an example of that from June of '98, is that I was in a sandwich shop, a Subway shop, had my back to the door, and I was just ordering my sandwich. And so I was still in a open state. And I heard the door open, you know, they had a little bell or whatever. And all of a sudden I felt this just anger, this just heavy anger. And I was like, what is that? And I didn't know this was part of what that experience is. And I turned and I looked, and a young woman about 20, 21 years old walked in dressed head to toe in black. And this was in June. Had the goth look, just the dark, and the whole expression on her face was just anger. But again, I felt it. And then I saw it. Yeah. And see, that's where that part of, you know, the special sensitivity is. If I'd have even known that phrase, that would have helped. You know, so yeah, no, it's interesting you brought that up, because there are parts of the documentary that I can definitely relate to. And then there's other parts not so much. But yeah, and to me, the documentary doesn't really use the word mystic much, or it does bring in Buddhism and some of those concepts. But right away I recognized, you know, here's this this not understood realm, if you want to call it that, you know, that crazy, but that there's wisdom from it. So a question, getting back to the film though, like I say, since it's been released, it's been 6 years. What were your expectations for, you know, how it would be received? How has it been received? I
can't say I had, you know, it made a lot of sense to me, but I hadn't really I didn't even think about expectations. I just wanted to put it out there.
Awesome.
It just made a lot of sense to me that if a person in that state that can be frightening is given a certain message, whether that message is, hey, you've got a special sensitivity that can help you and can help us as a community, is much better than you've got this chemical imbalance in your brain. There's really no cure for it, but we can stabilize you on these medications, and you can lead a somewhat normal life. You know, what I would like to hear if I was in one of those very vulnerable open states is, yeah, this is something I can use. It's something that can be valuable if I learn to use it correctly, or if I learn to harness it or manage it. And so to me, the difference is fear. Is this putting the person in a sense of need and fear, or is it something that can give the person a lot of hope in what's going on?
And I think that's where part of what I hope to do is help bring that message to the general public, not just the people dealing with it, because as you say, the reaction and the response from people close to that person. For me, I actually was helped more not by the people who were closest to me, but kind of that next level out. You know,
Yeah.
people I knew from school that I hadn't seen in 10 years.
That
Because
were curious, right?
well, or they didn't have the expectation of, and they weren't reacting in fear. So I was calm.
Yeah.
You know, I wasn't, but it's that, and again, it goes to that exchange of energy. And I think part of what drives fear in people and the family members is this idea that it's a chronic condition. And as mentioned in the documentary, I think it was John Reed out of New Zealand said, you know, in indigenous cultures, 2/3 of people come through this and learn something and it's transformational. Whereas in Western cultures, it's 1/3 at the most. You know, and so I really believe it's a process. And so we're stopping that process. We're not helping. I also call it a breech birth into mysticism. You know, that something that the process needs some help, but it doesn't mean you stop it or you try and prevent it from happening. You know, and yeah, so, but now the documentary itself has gone around the world. It's been seen in how many countries? Or
I think it's 64 now.
64. And I know it's been it has subtitles for a number of
Yeah, I just did the Polish subtitle, and the subtitles have all been done by volunteers.
that's awesome.
It's a program called Amara, but it's online, and we have the subtitles all spelled out in English. They can just look at the English sentence and translate it, and it times it to go into the film at the right time code. So it's pretty easy to use. And yeah, so that was the 16th translation,
Wow.
all done by volunteers, that just people who've been through the experience that want others to understand what they were going through.
Wow. I think that's fabulous that it's volunteers who help
Yeah.
step up and say, hey, we want this available for people in our community, in our country, in our language. To me, that says a lot. That, yeah. One thing I was curious about is that, you know, you approach this, as you mentioned, from a state of curiosity. What were some of the things after you started making the film that you learned? About, you know, you'd already, it seems to me you'd already learned quite a bit, or at least had enough to ask questions. But what were some of the key points you learned?
Well, curiosity is one, how effective it is. Adam, you know, so we meet Adam, the main character in the film, and he had his, we call it a psychotic break sometimes in this culture. He had that disturbance when he was 20. And as his mom said, it was terrifying. One minute we had this Adam, and the next minute he was this Adam. And that's what really frightens a person, the change that you can go through. And what he was talking about, she said he had this formula that would solve all the family's problems. And she said, of course, it made all the sense of the world to him, but of course to no one else. I mean, she was already kind of discounting what he was going through or what he was experiencing. And that's, and she was a wonderful woman, but she just didn't know. And, you know, for me as a filmmaker, sitting down with Adam every 1.5 to 2 weeks over this 6-year period, the only thing I had was to be curious as to what's happening now. What are you experiencing now? Not judging his experience, but just curious about it. And one of the things that, one of the sayings I love that one of the psychologists we interviewed says, you're not there to be a reality cop. You know, consensus, we're all in consensus reality, and we have a set of experiences we all agree on. Somebody steps out of that. We're not there to say, hey, what you're experiencing isn't your experience. No, it is their experience. And just be curious. And the other thing I heard a lot of, be light. You know, just, it isn't heavy. be willing to joke a little bit about what's going on and lighten the whole, feeling around what's happening.
And this gets to what the general public does or doesn't understand, or what, they've been taught from the model, that it's chronic and that this person has changed forever. I think if more people recognized it was temporary, it'd be easier to be light about it.
Yeah.
So to me, again, it's that interaction. And actually the concept of curiosity, I noticed it because before we spoke last month, I rewatched the film, and it was right at the end where Adam said, I documented it somewhere, I don't have the exact notes, but it was something about, having someone reach out in curiosity without their opinion was so helpful. Mm-hmm. And I recognize that too. But what I also found is that, you drew on this due to curiosity. Hey, what's going on here? Why is this going on? But also,
and I'll just say this about that. It's easy for me as a filmmaker. That's my job, is to ask questions.
Right.
It isn't, I wasn't being paid to make him better. I was just paid. My job was just to see what was happening. So it isn't that I knew this, but I found out later that those are the things that the professionals that know how to deal with this say. Be open, be willing to be uncertain, be curious. Mm-hmm. And those are the qualities that are best to use when you're with somebody in one of those extreme or non-ordinary states.
Well, and it's interesting because you bring that, and how I look at it is, I know Robert Whitaker was in the documentary a little bit, Mad in America, Anatomy of an Epidemic. He's an investigative journalist. And even this last week, I learned of a book that's related to involuntary commitment, and some of that's where things get really ugly. And the author was also an investigative journalist that had a family member, go through that. And it raised, and I think it is those questions, as opposed to saying, I know what's going on, you need to fit into my model. No, maybe I need to expand my model to try and understand what else is out there, is what it seems. Now, one thing, I know in the notes that I sent, as I looked at the people that you included in the documentary, there were, several from more of the medical side, the psychologists, psychiatrists, but there was also some from the Buddhist side, or there's more spiritual side, people with lived experience. Did you run into, did you notice how people use different languages or different elements of the language to try and describe things?
Well, yeah, to a certain extent. Well, the materialists, the how would I put it? The biomedical people would call it, they would explain it in terms of brain chemistry, which, by the way, has never been proven. So, and everybody knows that, but it's an easy way to explain it on a material level. Of course, your brain isn't functioning right now, and we have chemicals that can change that. The spiritual people kind of frame it in terms of, it's an opening, it's enlightenment, it's a potential enlightenment. People who are very religious in a classical sense can think it's, a devil entering the person, or it's a possession. Mm-hmm. And so it could be explained in many different ways, depending on where you're coming from. But to me, the thing that matters the most is how reassuring is the explanation. If it's frightening, you're going to get fear, and fear is the enemy of the process. It can make it go into very nasty directions, and the person can be very dangerous to themselves and others if it goes far enough. And the thing
that
that
is
I
such an
heard,
excellent statement.
the thing
Fear
that
is-
I heard that really made me think about things was from Stan Groff, who is a parapsychologist, I guess you would call him, or I guess you wouldn't call him a
You,
parasite. He's a psychiatrist that has he's treated many people over the years that have gone through these crises. And I asked him, who are the people that, how do you do a differential diagnosis on somebody in the States, whether it's a spiritual opening or a real pathology of some sort? And he said, there's really no differential diagnosis because it's kind of, the process is somewhat similar. The difference is if the person has gone into fear deep enough that they're starting to believe that things outside of themselves are controlling them. The CIA has bugs planted in their bedroom, or you know, there are even delusions of grandeur where I'm Jesus Christ now and I've come to save the world. If those feelings, especially the fear feelings,
yeah.
if they've gotten way out of hand, he says, I can't really help those people. It's the people that are still open to what's going on and curious themselves that he can step in and they can talk about what's going on and build some sort of understanding together. So
I'm a fan of Groff's work. I have a few of his books. So did he mention how he came to be interested in consciousness?
He was a psychiatrist working in Prague
Well,
for years.
he was
And
actually part of an LSD study.
oh yeah, well,
And
that's
so he hit some of these extreme states.
yes.
Yeah.
And he used LSD in his therapies. And but the thing I want to make sure we get across is LSD or any psychedelic is has to be used very carefully under supervision, under a trained guide.
Yes.
Especially if you have a tendency to spontaneously undergo these openings, which are, as you say, are somewhat of an ego disruption. And if you're spontaneously prone to that and you throw in a psychedelic on top of it, it can be, unless it's guided correctly, very dangerous to do.
Right. I see it can be as dangerous as the drug cocktails, where people end up on multiple drugs and are suppressed.
Yeah.
It's almost the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. The only reason I mentioned it is because he himself had hit a non-ordinary state of consciousness. In his case, it was kind of this nirvana, pure bliss, thing. But my understanding from the book I read is that he recognized, wow, consciousness is separate from the body. And so, so no, and I was pleased to see that you were able to interview him. I think it was just shortly after that he did retire in his late 80s. So,
oh, he's still going strong. He's 90 and he just did a talk over in.
Oh, did he?
Yeah, no, he's still out there working. He's 91, I think.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to.
A friend of mine who's in close contact with
Oh
him.
wow, yeah, no, I didn't know that. I thought he had retired, and but I know he's in his early 90s. And
that did happen right after we interviewed him and his wife Christina. The both of them are coined the term spiritual emergency.
Right.
Happenings. She passed away shortly after.
And she had been a student of Joseph Campbell's.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a connection in there. Getting back to this concept of support, have you ever heard of polyvagal theory, the nervous system?
I've heard of it, but tell me more.
Well, because there's a few different parts of it, but one part of it, it talks about how nervous systems talk to each other and need to co-regulate. And I should say, for the last couple of years, I've always had to try and remember, because the guy who developed that was Stephen Borges.
Oh.
And so whenever I'm talking about one or the other, I'm like, is it Borges? Which is it?
I should know about it then.
Yeah, it's like, now I have it down, but for a while. But co-regulation has to do with that support and the need for the nervous system in whatever, I would say, in whatever state it's in, is trying to find something to co-regulate with.
Yeah.
And, that's where I know Adam made the comment of he had checked himself in, I believe, to a hospital at first, or somewhere in the process.
Yeah, early
something
on, they decided to try a mental health facility, and he got frightened there.
Right. And
For it.
yeah, and when you think of, the sterility, the whether it's heavy doors or, barren rooms or whatever, there's nothing.
Or being restrained.
Being restrained, forcibly medicalized. People have drugs, given inserted into them without their consent. I mean, it gets really ugly. But I look at it as someone who's had this. There's a reason I thought, do I call it a nervous breakdown? I chose to call it a stress breakdown because it was the stress that caused the breakdown of the nervous system or the reorganizing. That's how I chose. But things like, you mentioned in the documentary, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but things like nervous breakdown aren't in there.
It's funny, when I was a kid, they called it an identity crisis.
Oh, yeah. Well,
that term was used a lot.
And that relates to ego. We're back to, there's some overlap there. Yeah.
So anything, and I learned through the movie that just anything that disrupts your sense of self, in a massive way, be it, you base your self-worth on your wealth or your status or your beauty or whatever. If any one of those items that you rely too heavily on for your identity is ripped away from you, that can put you in this state very easily.
And it's interesting because just even as you described that, it goes to that was your support.
Yeah.
Or your understructure in this, what we call consensus reality. And so without that, then things crumble and maybe it should.
Well, it gets you to reevaluate who you are.
Right.
Sure.
And what's important and prioritize. And in those cases, it doesn't have to be as complete as what some of the visions and some of the, I think there's different, scale of experience. It can be relatively minor. It can be, and I even said shortly after I was in Banff, is that even in terms of a stress breakdown, if you need to quantify it and say it's a gargantuan one, go for it. This was a big one. This one interrupted my life to where I couldn't work for a period of time.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean it's permanent.
Right.
And so, one curious thing, the question I have is, so I get a lot of synchronicity. I notice signs. I still notice signs. Even a couple of years ago, I was just chatting with a complete stranger up in Glacier National Park, a young woman. And after I shared a few stories, she goes, "Are you a medium?" If I'd have been on the ball, I'd have said, "No, I'm a large." But she picked up on kind of this connection that I noticed. I noticed that there wasn't a whole lot about synchronicity. It wasn't mentioned in the documentary, but did that come up as a concept with some of the people you interviewed, or?
That they had a lot of synchronicity.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Adam was having them all the time. And to the point, it got frightening because he didn't know if he was dreaming or not, or which reality he was in. But he would have a thought and then it would happen. So he thought, well, I'm creating my own reality. And
I shouldn't laugh, but I totally get it. Yeah.
Yeah. So synchronicities, time warps, synchronicities, a feeling of unity or being connected. And you said something that really made me think too, was that feeling of unity I've always associated with, oh man, we all feel like one. What a kumbaya experience. But it could be just the opposite. It could be, you know, the generational trauma comes in, or that unity is smothering you. You're disappearing as an individual. And we live in a very individualistic culture. Some call it the culture of the ego, compared to many of the other mainstream cultures, like in Asia. So, but that feeling of unity, that the time works. I've had people say, when I was in that state, you know, 3 minutes could seem like all day, and all day could seem like 3 minutes. And what else? Just creativity tends to go up. You know, you start seeing connections that other people aren't seeing, that are obvious to you, synchronicities. So it's a very interesting state that, and you know, now people are exploring it again with psychedelics, and there is a definite value in that. I think, especially if what you learn in that psychedelic experience is integrated in a way that helps you increase your compassion, increase your direction and understanding of what you're here for, and give you meaning. And many people can get that in one of these experiences or in a psychedelic experience. But it's something that you're given this gift of either this disruption or this psychedelic experience. Then you've got to integrate what you've seen, what you've learned. And that's a lifelong process. Well,
and to me, as you were talking about increase, I was thinking of growth. You know, I mean, it really is what it is. And even earlier this morning, I was checking the memories page on my social media, and I had shared, you know, the butterfly wouldn't be beautiful if the caterpillar wasn't brave. And to me, it's not even about being brave. It's just, that was the process. You know, it's not like I consciously said, gee, I think I'm going to go have this experience. It's just what happened. And there's no going back from the butterfly back to the caterpillar, which I think ties in with the fear that people around you have. You know, as they're used to you being kind of the caterpillar and don't understand the process. Shoot, there was something that one thing you had said about the unity, kind of the oneness, and you mentioned kind of the kumbaya, the positive side of it. But one thing I say is that if all is interconnected, which is kind of what that theme is of unity, well, that includes the garbage. I mean, you know, I mean, if it's truly all interconnected, it is all interconnected. And that was part of my experience, and kind of that more negative side of things, you know, the generational, the legacy of that generational, the energy that some people still feel. I heard last year there was a Native American man, and as it turns out, this was on an interview, you know, webinar thing. He has an office in Bozeman where I live. And so when I looked him up, I'm like, hey, you know, so I'll reach out to him at some point. But he had mentioned how he was driving through Colorado, and before he saw a sign of what he was approaching, he felt this just heaviness and this sorrow, this deep sorrow. And then shortly after that, he saw the sign to one of the Native American battlefields where the Native Americans had all been killed and massacred. And so it's like, again, he felt that before he saw and that wasn't his energy, you know, that was kind of this legacy energy. Let's see, I'm scrolling down through my notes. So do you keep in touch with Adam and Akaya at all, or?
I haven't touched base with Adam in several months. I was in touch with him quite frequently. He's moved to the Okanagan, which is a
Oh,
very, you know, the Okanagan.
oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the Okanagan
North
Valley up
Central.
there. Yes,
Yeah,
up near the Canadian border. That's up in northern Washington State.
right.
That's where I am right now. Anyway, and it's hard to get in touch with him. He
Ah,
hasn't, he was on Facebook for a while, and I'm not on Facebook much.
oh,
So
okay.
every once in a while I would get something on Messenger, but I haven't heard from him recently. Last time I went up and saw him was probably about 4 months ago,
Oh, wow.
and he was doing well at that time.
Oh,
He
fabulous. I'm glad.
had a job as he was doing carpentry for people that live up in there. You know, people that it's very sparsely
Right.
populated.
Yeah.
So he would, you know, have jobs at different sites, working mostly carpentry, and he was very good at it. He was doing very well, and he really liked it. So things were going well for him. He's living up there with his dog,
Oh, nice. Nice.
Jasper. So
Yeah. No, because from what was chronicled in the film, I mean, he went through years of
yeah,
hell.
and
And
we saw him go through the depths of
yeah,
hell,
yeah.
really. Akaya is a teacher. She lectures around the world
Oh,
now.
wow.
She's down in LA, near LA, up in the mountains, though, outside of LA. And she has her center there, and she does different workshops. So she's very
Fabulous.
involved in spiritual work.
Well, and I remember from the film, I think it was towards the end, as she was moving into a direction of training and embracing the shamanism training, that she said, nobody told me this was a spiritual matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that just struck me
Yeah.
because, I was lucky because I knew it all along,
Oh,
but the people
yeah, you
around
are
me
lucky.
didn't. You know what I mean? The people around me didn't. And so then you get accused of rejecting treatment and everything else.
Yeah.
But it worked out better for me. It was hard, but when I think of what could have happened, it still is. It still sends chills sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can go into some pretty dark places, and Adam did for a while.
Mhm.
And one of the times, as you know, he got beat up when
Yeah.
he was living on the beach in Hawaii and almost killed. And that just sent him into a PSD.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, PTSD.
PTS response. Yeah.
Yeah, and he went into a very dark place, and that's when he started distrusting me.
Right.
We had bonded up to that point, and he was saying, I'm doing this film, and you're going to make all this money on this film. And I've always joked and said that was the most delusional I ever saw. There's no money in making documentaries unless you're quite lucky, and some of them do. But so there was one point where he said, Phil, I want to talk to you. And it was during that dark period. And he had called me up and he said, I want to go out and take a walk out in the woods. And just before that, I'd taken him to Sound Mental Health here to get him some housing. And the woman interviewing him, and I put this in the film,
Okay.
I clandestinely filmed this scene where she's typing him in and just asked him, do you have thoughts of hurting anyone or yourself? And he said, yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
And she said, do you have a weapon? He said, I am a weapon. I'm a black belt in karate.
Wow.
He got his black belt when he was 11. He's very physically talented. Anyway, so he wants to go out in the woods with me. And he's in this state and not trusting me all of a sudden. And so I got paranoid.
Right.
So anyway, I drove out to meet him, and I could just feel his energy. And we started walking into the woods, and I'm thinking, anyway, he turned to me at one point and said, Phil, is this film going to hurt me or help me? Oh. And I just had to think, I don't know.
Yeah.
I said, Adam, you're very brave in doing this. And I just hope that people see your courage in
Yeah.
putting life out there when you're in this state.
Yeah.
And it was so emotional. And at the same time, we financed the film through Kickstarter. So we had 700 backers that were expecting a film. And here we're 3/4 of the way through, and Adam may go away. So I felt all this pressure, and I kind of just broke down and got real emotional. And Adam put his arm around me. He said, "Take it easy, Phil. You're going to be okay." And he was
Oh,
consoling me. And
that's
he said,
awesome.
"Oh, this film is the only thing I can be doing right now to contribute." And he said, and we rebonded at that point. I'll never forget it. And it was the things that, again, I relied on what I learned from all the psychologists I interviewed. Be uncertain. Don't be afraid to be uncertain. Like, I don't know. Be vulnerable and be curious. All those things are states of mind that are very helpful when you're around somebody that's going into one of those paranoias.
And it's interesting because even as a state of mind, especially for someone not in that state of mind, you can more easily consciously decide what state of mind to be in. And also along those lines, one thing I wanted to point out is that, this idea of kind of a split from reality or a split from this physical world is sometimes how I look at it, is too often we don't look at what the person's experience is in this world. And if in that state, all they receive is fear, that's not inviting someone to come back. That this world then becomes a place that isn't safe to return to. And so no, what a fascinating story. I did want to point out, I know I shared it with you that I'd perused the website, which is crazywisefilm.com. We'll mention it at the end, and I'll include it in the notes. But on one of the blog posts, it has a video of Adam. I think it was one of the original blog posts, but below it, for me, it was interesting because, again, it talks about this relationship of psychosis to mysticism, but it says Adam's description of his psychotic break is reminiscent of the state of consciousness that mystics and long-term meditators describe after years of disciplined practice. I find that fascinating, that it isn't just that that's what they pursue, but that what he describes is what kind of seasoned long-term people in training seek.
Yeah. I mean, I can identify. I meditated for years and I've never had that feeling he talks about.
Yeah. And
to the extent he had. So in a way, it is a gift, that comes along if it doesn't scare you. And when he talked about when he first went into that state, he said, at first it was fun and exciting. It was, it was like incredible. It was the first time I felt connected to the universe, where I was it was me. But then I kept going and I went too far, and then it got scary.
Right.
And I came to learn that going too far was being frightened by the reaction of his parents.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Interesting.
His mom really got frightened by it because, I mean, it was for her, she adored Adam, and here he was this funny, happy-go-lucky kid. And she says it in the film. And then in one moment, then it's like this, and you have this Adam. And, and it didn't go well during that time.
Yeah. One thing that the film starts with the quote from Rumi that says, "The wound is where the light enters you," which is one of my favorite quotes. I have a lot of favorite quotes, though. And I've been known to say there were massive wounds. And yesterday I actually rewatched the film just because it'd been a little while and I wanted to make sure I had some points. And there was a spot where you showed at least some of Adam's writings. You showed some of his notes. And I actually paused the documentary because I've made my own notes. And that's just all part of this analysis. It's part of trying to capture as much information as you can. And there was one in there that said, one comment was God is light, which I didn't notice previously, which of course ties in with the Rumi quote.
Yeah.
Right. Did you see that when you put that in?
Yeah, I've seen that. And then all the equations.
Yeah. But there was, go ahead.
The me to the second power equals, I can't remember them all, but he gets them into mathematical equations.
I'm a math person. So you're touching on one that I wanted to mention here. Was one of them was I plus me equals you. And I don't quite get the you part. And of course, I hadn't spoken with him or anything. But even this I plus me, just earlier this week, and I'd have to dig through and come across the links again. But there were a couple different articles about how is either I is the subjective and me is the objective, which is true in grammar. But it goes to how we experience the world. And so bringing those two together is what's important. And that actually ties in with Carl Jung, who spoke about individuation, incorporating the concepts of the shadow and stuff like that. And so just for me to have come across this concept of I and me a few days ago and then notice the equation yesterday was just kind of
I hadn't thought of that one.
See, and that's where like someone else who might have been familiar with some of that, professional could have seen that and go, oh, this is where he is in consciousness.
Yeah.
This is the kind of material that's coming in. And with regard to these non-ordinary states of consciousness and the initial fear of what this is, it's, when you fall through the ice and fall into ice water, you're going to be fearful and flounder and stuff like that. But when it comes to these non-ordinary states, at least in the Western cultures, we don't even know they're there, or at least the majority of people don't even know they're there. So here I am dealing with this state of consciousness that I didn't even know existed. So no wonder you don't know how to navigate it, right?
Yeah. I mean, who in our culture teaches it?
Yeah. Well, so I think there are some, and that's part of what I want to help do through these kinds of interviews or my story.
There are definitely some, and we've got a list of them on the website in the resource.
Right.
People that understand more than just the medical model of what's going on in the
and that there's more than just the physical.
Yeah,
that's kind of how I look at it too. So yeah, I'm just looking at the time. I don't remember just quite when I hit start, or record, but I think we're coming up on an hour. I was aiming for maybe 40-45 minutes, but I have one final question.
Sure.
So when is the sequel coming out?
There are times where I start thinking, I've interviewed so many people like yourself that have had these experiences now and have managed to navigate them successfully. And I've become more and more convinced that, and when they navigate them successfully, like you, they find a purpose in sharing what they learned while going through it, or set them on a path of contributing to the whole once they get that feeling that they're a part of everything. That was something we didn't really emphasize that much in the film. It was mainly how you react to somebody in that state, but just telling the story of how that can unfold in a person's life, I think is a very valuable story. I don't know if I'll ever do it, I'm taking a break right now. But yeah, it's been 6 years since the film came out, and um, I just have to wait and see what.
Okay, well, hey, at least the answer isn't no. I was kind of
Yeah.
thinking, no, hey, I'm retired.
Well, I started CrazyWise Conversations, and that's a part of the website where you can go and there's several people there that tell about their experience and what it's done to them. The other thing we're doing there is looking into this whole renaissance in psychedelics and how that relates to our understanding of not only these states, these what I like to call expanded states of consciousness, where you expand to your sense of who you are into more than just this body with encased in the skin that's separate ego. So those are the things I would love to explore a little more. And we're doing a little bit in CrazyWise Conversations. I may start doing more of those interviews as time goes on.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I was figuring, you know, I said the question kind of in jest. I intentionally didn't include it when I sent you the list of topics originally. But I was like, man, they could call it Crazy Wiser. They could, we could go anywhere with that concept. And so, no, it's good to know that there are still some elements of that, and that's why I look at CrazyWise very much as a flotation device. You know, that it's what, about an hour and 20 minutes. And there's so much information in there, and that even just looking at the people involved, then you can go look them up and learn more about them and expand, understand.
I learned so much from all the experts and psychologists, mental health professionals, sociologists that really opened my eyes to
Well,
who I am.
Thank you so much for your work and so much for your curiosity in bringing this to the fore. And I just think of these people all around the world, these different countries, these different languages, that people have embraced it so that they can share it, continue to share it, and may it continue so. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Penny. Good luck. And I love what you're doing. And just let me know any way I could participate or help.
Bless your heart. Thank you so much.